Yesterday we looked at one of the detestable practices and customs of the people of Canaan that caused God's anger to give a command to the people of Israel to completely destroy them. The people of Israel were to completely destroy all of those Canaanites because one of their practices was to sacrifice the firstborn child born into the family and then bury that child under the floor of their home as an offering to a false god. And the true God did not want his people being influenced by that. He didn't want his people to practice the custom of human sacrifice. It was not something he wanted because human life was so important to him. But there's one instance in the Old Testament you're probably familiar with where God actually asks one of his people to sacrifice his son. Abraham, God's chosen man, is asked one day by God to take his son up to a mountain and sacrifice him to God as a burnt offering. And this might seem really inconsistent to you, and at first glance it's very inconsistent that God would ask his own person, Abraham, upon whom all of Israel was built, to sacrifice his son, and yet his anger was so large at people who were sacrificing their own children to false gods that he demanded that they all be killed. What's going on here? Well, the account of Abraham is very interesting, and I would encourage you to read it. It's Genesis chapter 22. The story goes, or the account goes, that Abraham took Isaac and a servant, and they headed off towards the mountain. They got to the bottom of the mountain, left the servant behind, and Isaac and his father went up the mountain with a pack of wood and a knife. And Isaac says, "Hey, Dad, there's no lamb for this sacrifice. What are we going to do when we get to the top?" And his dad, Abraham, says, "God will provide." And we get to the top of the mountain, and Abraham binds his son Isaac and ties him to the altar and pulls out the knife and is about to plunge the knife into the kid's chest. And a voice tells Abraham to stop. And Abraham looks, and there's a sheep or a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. And that's what they end up sacrificing. Now, it's an interesting thing because there's a lot to take from this, a whole lot more than I'm going to give you in a 5-minute devotion. But God knew exactly how Abraham was going to respond. This whole moment was not for God to see what Abraham would do. He's God. He knows exactly what we're going to do. He knew the outcome of this story long before it happened, and he knew how Abraham would respond. But there were two people there that did not know how Abraham would respond. Abraham and Isaac. Neither one of them knew how they were going to respond until they were there. And that's just the way it is with life. We like to think we know how we would respond in a given situation, but you don't know until you're in that situation. And so this testing for Abraham was really to show Abraham what he was made of. Abraham needed some reassurance that the task ahead of him, which was huge, that God believed in him, that God thought he was capable of handling it. And so this test, part of the reason God asked for this test, this sacrifice, was so that Abraham could see what his faith was made of, and so that Abraham could see that when he steps out in faith, even when it didn't make sense to him, that God was going to show up and come through for him. So the same is true for us. There will be moments that test our faith. Maybe today you're going to have one of those moments, but if you don't today, you're certainly going to in the very near future. You're going to have a moment, you're going to have a season that tests your faith, and you will be given the choice. Do you obey or do you walk away? Do you obey even though it doesn't make sense, even though the scripture doesn't make sense and you can't figure out why? Will you still obey? When we find ourselves in those testing moments, those testing seasons, God is showing us what we're made of and what our faith is made of and where we need to grow. And he's also showing us what he's made of and that he will always come through. So if you're in a testing situation, if you're in a testing season, just keep being faithful. Keep doing what you know to be right. Keep doing what the scripture tells us to do. And in the end, God's going to be there. He's going to come through for you. And it's going to be a moment where you find out what you, your faith, and your God are all made of. It's for our good when we get tested. So let's be faithful. Bye.